Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcoming you to the to one of the last sessions at this very exciting seminar that we've had the last 3 days. I'm Elia Zulu. I'm the chair moderator of this session on poverty, where we have 3 really exciting papers and my colleague, Catherine Bigo from the World Bank, who moderate the Q&A component of this exciting session. So I'm not gonna spend a lot of time and just want to get us started by introducing the first speaker, who is Amuna Shifa from the SCI University of Cape Town. And she's going to talk about spatial inequality through the prism of a pandemic, COVID-19 in South Africa. But just a couple of things about Muna. Muna is a senior research officer in the South Africa Labor and Development Research Unit in the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. And she holds a PhD in economics from University of Cape Town as well. That's all I'll say for now, and I'll ask Muna to get the video for Muna play, and then we'll move from there to the next speaker. Thank you. Please play the video.
Virtual greetings to all. My name is Muna Shifa. I'm a senior researcher from SALGRU. And the topic of my presentation is spatial inequality through the prism of the pandemic, COVID-19 in South Africa. This is a joint work by me, Anda David from FT, and Professor Marie Lebrand from SALGRU. So the main objective of the paper is to examine to what extent households are vulnerable to COVID-19 infection due to their living circumstances. There is previous research which showed that previous major pandemics like COVID-19, similar to COVID-19, are disproportionately affected poor people. And this is mainly because poor people often have large number of underlying risk factors to COVID-19 kind of infection. And what makes the COVID-19 pandemic different is the measures used to contain the virus across the globe. Many countries implemented lockdown policies, of course, to different degrees. And this prompted 3 types of research regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. The first one is, of course, clearly to analyze the direct health impact of the pandemic. And the second type of research is to analyze the impact of lockdown policies on various socio-economic outcomes, such as poverty, inequality, and labor market outcomes. And then the emerging evidence showed that poor people are disproportionately affected by the lockdown policy. And the third type of research examines to what extent households are able to follow WHO recommendations in order for them to prevent themselves from the virus. These recommendations include washing the hands with soap and water regularly, keeping social distancing either in the household or outside the household, and also getting reliable information about the virus and using masks in public places, etc. So our research is in line with the third type of research. There are some previous works, but they mainly focus analyzing the vulnerability at the national level. So we provide detailed spatial analysis using data from South Africa, which is a country which is significantly affected by the COVID-19 virus, and also a country which is characterized by high level of spatial inequality. So for measuring vulnerability, we use data from the 2016 community survey. This is the latest data available for us to do our analysis. Especially, we want our estimation to be to provide estimations at local municipality level. However, we compared our estimates at national and province level using a more recent data set from 2018, and our results are fairly comparable. In order to measure vulnerability, COVID-19 infection, we use the following 6 indicators, and these indicators are the following: sharing water source in other households, sharing toilets with other households, and having no access to radio or TV, having a large household member, and having an individual older than 16 living with younger or more younger people, and lack of access to refrigerator. So these indicators are trying to these indicators allows us to identify households which are at higher risk of being infected if they are exposed to an infected person. So if they share water or toilet facilities with other households, it limits their ability to implement social distancing. And having a large household size means it's also difficult to implement isolation if someone is infected in the household. Lack of access to TV or radio means they might not have reliable information about the virus or about the recommendations what to do to prevent themselves. Lack of a fridge means they are more likely to go to shopping in order to buy food. So which means that it increases the risk of contact with other individuals. In terms of measuring vulnerability, we use 3 kinds of approaches. First, we provide detailed mapping of each indicator. We provide estimates of each indicator. Second, we calculated an index, average vulnerability score, and we weighted each indicator equally. This is because we don't have conceptual clarity in terms of how we weight each indicator. So we give each indicator equal weight and calculate an aggregate score for each individual. And the third one is we use a counting method. We just simply count the number of vulnerability indicators for each individual. So an individual could be vulnerable due to 1 indicator, or 2 indicators, or 3 indicators, or 4 or more indicators. So we provide these 3 types of measures to measure vulnerability using the 6 indicators. So with regard to the result, we have provided a lot of estimations in the paper, but I provide only the main highlights. So in this graph, I have 2 types of figures. The first one shows here average vulnerability score, and the second one presents the percentage of people by the number of vulnerability indicators. So we can see clearly that a significant gap between rural and urban areas. The average vulnerability score is much higher in rural areas compared to national and urban figures. We find similar kind of pattern when we look at the number of vulnerability indicators. So if you look at vulnerability indicators, 2 indicators, 3 indicators, or 4 above indicators, the proportion of people who are vulnerable due to 2 or 3 or more indicators are higher in rural areas compared to urban areas. So it shows clear gap between rural and urban areas. Okay, the next result shows the average vulnerability scored by province and municipality. So the province level clearly shows also significant gap or inequality among the provinces. The average vulnerability score is significantly higher, relatively higher in Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, in Limpopo, and Northern Cape provinces, while it's relatively lower in Western Cape, Free State, and Gauteng provinces. However, when we look at the municipality level figure, we can see also significant inequalities within Eastern Cape. There are areas which have relatively low level of vulnerability, while areas with significantly higher level of vulnerability scores. We also find similar kind of pattern when we look at municipalities in KwaZulu-Natal and other provinces such as Northern and Northern Cape provinces. So this clearly shows us a high level of spatial inequality across provinces and across municipalities in terms of the extent of vulnerability. We find similar pattern when we use the counting approach also. Provinces such as Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, and Northwest are among the provinces with high proportion of people with vulnerability, large number of vulnerability. Next, we looked at whether there is a wealth effect, which means whether poor people are disproportionately vulnerable to COVID-19 infection. In order to measure household wealth, we use 22 indicators of household asset holdings and basic access to basic services such as availability of piped water and availability of proper sanitation facilities. So the graph here shows at national level, on the x-axis we have quantiles of the wealth index. On the y-axis we have average vulnerability for each quantile. So we can clearly see that the average vulnerability index is significantly higher for those in the poorest quantile, and it decreases as we go along to the richest quantile. We also looked at results by province. Here we looked at the incidence of vulnerability for quantile 1 and quantile 5 only. So as you can see clearly, we can focus on one of the indicators, the proportion of people who are vulnerable due to 4 or more indicators. To compare that between the two quantiles, we can clearly see that at national level, about 24% of the population can be considered vulnerable due to 4 indicators or more in the first quantile or the poorest quantile, while the corresponding figure for the richest quantile is only 0.4%. So we can clearly see that there is high or strong wealth effect. We also looked at the relationship between vulnerability and wealth at municipality level. So what we have here is on the x-axis, average wealth index for each municipality, and on the y-axis we have vulnerability index for each municipality, average vulnerability index for each municipality. So we can clearly see that there is a strong negative relationship between wealth and average vulnerability. So municipalities which are relatively rich have lower level of vulnerability, while municipalities which are poor have high level of vulnerability. So in summary, our results show that there is significant inequality in terms of vulnerability to COVID-19 in South Africa. And this is a reflection of the existing socio-economic inequality in the country. And we find also strong positive wealth effects in vulnerability to COVID-19. This means regardless of where poor people are living, their living conditions preventing themselves from protect themselves from COVID-19 infection. Thank you.
Elia, I'm not sure.
Sorry, yeah.
Oh, good.
I think I was speaking and then I forgot to unmute. I apologize for that. So thanks a lot for that video, that presentation from Muna Shifa. And now we're moving on to the next presentation that's going to be made by I'm just trying, by Amy Thornton from the University of Cape Town. And Amy has a master's in applied economics from the University of Cape Town as well, obtained in 2016. And she's a PhD student there at the University of Cape Town now. So Amy, I think over to you, and I will play the video for Amy. Thank you.
Oh.
The presentation is entitled Trends in Household Headship and Living Alone in South Africa. So another paper based on South Africa.
My name is Amy Thornton, and I'm a PhD student at the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. So my work has been on household formation in post-apartheid South Africa. And so I think it's really important that I motivate why I'm in a session on poverty. So I'm going to start off with
Hello, is
one
everything
slide about
okay?
the
Are we
outcome and the
facing
study,
a
and then really
challenge
spend some
there?
time explaining why
It's
this matters
going.
for welfare.
All right.
So all around the world, and for a very long time now, average household size has been declining. And this is happening because people are forming households more quickly than the population is growing. And South Africa, in our census data from the post-apartheid period, really reflects this. So you can see in this table that between 1996 and 2011, the household stock increased by 62%, but the population by less than half of that. And as a result, average household size declined. So why does this matter for poverty and for welfare? Well, there are a number of reasons. So firstly, smaller households means smaller household economies of scale. So for an individual household member, accessing household public goods is that much more expensive, like electricity or food preparation. However, the household is also the unit that is usually serviced by the government. For example, it's the unit that gets connected to the grid. So if there are more households, that increases the infrastructure burden on the state to supply the same size population with services. And actually, there is evidence from South Africa that I've referenced on the screen that this exact phenomenon happened in a rural area in Mpumalanga. And related to this idea around the household being the unit that is serviced is environmental sustainability. So we also know that the marginal household has a bigger carbon footprint because of this than the marginal person. So this trend also has implications for environmental sustainability. What this trend also suggests, although maybe at first blush, it's not clear whether this is necessarily good or bad for welfare, is changing household form, meaning evolving livelihood strategies. And at least in South Africa, there is some evidence that this might be presenting a challenge. So we know that there have been more female household heads over time, for example, but we also know that these households are themselves more reliant on female labor market earnings and grant income, which has actually increased their risk of falling into poverty compared to male-headed households. So understanding this is all wrapped up in changing household form. But there is another sort of bigger measurement point, actually, about why changing household form is really important for welfare. So in South Africa, and I think in many places around the world, our measurement of welfare relies on per capita household income, or some equivalized version of this. And what that means is that from household survey data, we are calculating something like we're taking total household income and we're dividing that by household size. And this is often the input or the raw material for something like a poverty head count or a Gini coefficient. And so it is quite clear when you look at this equation on the screen how the household and its form and all the assumptions that we make about how resources are gathered and distributed in the household are really cemented into our welfare measurement. Both because the household sort of draws this line around whose income gets included, and obviously quite directly through household size. So what this means is that if there is a structural trend in your denominator, for example, this is going to have some quite profound implications for welfare measurement. And so household change then becomes this really critical context for any series of welfare statistics, and I think challenges us quite directly to think about what we're measuring. But this critical context is sort of what this paper is all about. So that's exactly what we're doing. In this paper, I describe household change in post-apartheid South Africa. So to do this, there are some sort of first order outcomes of interest, sort of how many households are there in each year, and how many single person households. And there are answering these questions is maybe harder than you might think because there are some important data quality issues that I'm not going to go into in this particular presentation. But because I'm sort of pivoting around these counts and the numbers of households, that informs how I think about household proliferation and describing the change. So we really pivot on household headship. So I think about understanding household change by thinking about how household headship rates have evolved over time. Because in my data, which I'll describe shortly, I have one household head per household, and obviously there's one person living in a single person household as well. So I think about how these things move. I think about household heads as an important person or important decision maker about thinking about forming a household. And then I think about how these trends change with employment, marriage, and social spending. All right, so the data that I'm going to use to do this is I use a stacked series of nationally representative cross sections comprised of the October household survey and the general household survey. And what I must really emphasize is that these data sets are the only data sets that I can use to do the specific task that I'm doing, which is thinking about household change in a nationally representative way and over this period, in a way that also includes this period in the 90s, immediately after the end of apartheid. And what's also really important is how that then is how the household is expressed in these data. This is a key issue for the study of households. And unfortunately, because these are the only data I can use, I have to use definition in these data, and that is unfortunately quite a strict one. So to be a household member, you have to have spent the previous 4 nights sleeping in that dwelling, which by South African standards, where we have well-established ideas around stretched households and labour migrants, is quite strict. So in South Africa, you might have, for example, an urban migrant who retains his membership of a rural homestead. And I can't see that with my data, and that is a limitation here. However, there's still much to be learned, even using the strict definition. And also the strict definition means that I have no double counting. Okay, then in the bottom half of that slide, I've sort of talked a bit about how we've reweighted the data. So we spent a lot of time really thinking about measurement and extracting accurate trends, because there are some serious data quality problems that I'm not going to go into. But the point is that we've thought hard about measurement, and we've done this thinking about it. So this is my first result. So what I'm showing you here are household headship rates by gender and race over time. Okay. And we're looking at race because in South Africa, due to our recent apartheid history, race is always an important analytic category. So what I'm plotting is the frequency of heads in the adult population over time. And you can see that that's increased by about 5 percentage points at the bottom there, but with important divergences by gender and race. So for men, you can see it's pretty much Black African men who have increased the rate at which they've headed households with this sort of slow boil pattern. For white men, that's purely an age effect, which I talk about in the paper, but not getting into detail here. For women, you can see that there's a very clear, for all race groups, there's this very clear sort of like boom plateau pattern, and this boom happens mainly in the 90s. It's very, very, very clear. So moving to single person households, so something I haven't mentioned, which is sort of motivates studying single person households, is that they've really increased dramatically in the country as a whole. And by 2011, over a quarter of households in South Africa were a single person, which is very high, even by developed country standards. And this is obviously related to our long history of migrant labor. And you can see from this plot that although the rate at which one-person households occur in the adult population, so this is the rate at which adults live alone, has also increased by 5 percentage points. This is like an 80% increase, right? So this has really increased much more quickly than the general rate of household headship. And this has really been owed to Black African men who have had this sort of meteoric rise in the rate at which they're living alone, from something like 9% to like 17%. So why is this happening? So in the paper, we sort of weave together these 3 main narrative threads based on thinking about the 3 main things that people think about when it comes to household formation, which is getting older, getting married, and getting a job. These are sort of the main things people think about, where age is sort of associated with preferences. So the first important story is the feminization of the labor market that happened in the 90s. So after apartheid, there was a big spike in female labor force participation, and we can see that reflected in increased employment rates. So the blue line in this plot is the headship rate. You've already seen that. And the black line is the employment rate. So it is the share of employed adults in the population. And the headship rates really track the employment rate very closely. I think it's very striking and clearly shows how important access to a job is for household formation. And you can see the boom for women coincides with this increase in the employment rate. Okay, but this is not the full story, right? So increased access to the labor market, clearly very important, but it's not the full story. Because what we also find is that after apartheid, the government embarked on this large-scale expansion in providing social grants to the population, and female heads are much more reliant on these grants. So here what I'm showing you is a table of labor market status and grant income access for household heads. And what you can see, if I draw your attention to the top part of this panel, you can see that even in 2011, less than half of female heads were employed, compared to about 2/3 of male household heads in both instances. So there is much more labor market income for male household heads. Whereas if we look at grant income, so what I've listed there are the two most important grants, which is the pension and the child support grant. So children are recipients, so I'm plotting there adults who are co-reside with children receiving the child support grant. And we can see that female heads are about twice as likely, twice as reliant on that grant income compared to men. And the third part of the story, which I'm really still trying to understand, is change in marriage markets. So like many other places in the world, marriage rates have been declining in South Africa. And what we see is, in terms of household headship, is sort of the rise of the never married head. And this is very important for single person households as well. So here we have marital status of household heads. And in 2011, being never married was the most common marital status for female heads, whereas this was sort of tied with widows in 1996. For men, male household heads are most likely to be co-resident, married co-resident heads. What that means is that they are married living with their spouse, but the main change also was an increase in never married heads, which is closely tied to living alone as well. Okay, to wrap up, the main takeaway is that there has been a structural change in household form in South Africa, which is really important for welfare measurement, or welfare in general, because it also reflects these changing livelihood strategies. It has important implications for environmental sustainability and the state's ability to actually provide its population with decent living standards. And what this paper has shown is try to sort of measure that household change better in terms of actual household counts and headship rates. And we can show that headship is really gendered. So Black African men are really behind this boom in single person living, whereas women, their boom in the 90s was sort of related to the feminization of the labor market and better access to grant income. And this has all interacted quite importantly with the marriage market. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks for that exciting presentation from Thornton there. And so we'll be moving now to our last presentation, which is going to be a paper on India now, to be on poverty reduction and in rural India during 2004-2005 to 2011 to 2012. And so they are looking at the role of growth redistribution and population shifts. Our two authors, Subramaniam Chandra and Karthikeya, Karthikeya, and both Chandra from the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, and Kathia from the India Institute of Management. So just looking forward to your presentation. I think let's play the video there on that presentation on India. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chandrasekhar, and I'm here to present my joint work with Karthikeya. We are grateful for the opportunity to present our work at this conference. And a big thank you to Paul and Peggy, whose untiring efforts ensured that we could actually have this conference online. The context of this paper, as is evident from the title, is India. We focus on the period 2004-5 to 2011-12. During this period, India's GDP grew by over 2.6 times. There was an increase in the rate of reduction of poverty. The total number of rural poor declined by 110 million. But the problem was the rural India continued to account for 83% of India's poor. Also, poverty got concentrated in 8 Indian states. These states were not very heavily urbanized even today. And these states have relatively higher fertility and mortality rates. And these states have limited non-farm opportunities. Which are these 8 states? They are Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, Jharkhand, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Uttarakhand. This is to just give you a sense of where these 8 Indian states are. There's a large literature on poverty reduction, what are the factors that determine poverty reduction, and whether the growth process has actually been inclusive. So what is it that we are actually doing different in this paper? A central point in this paper is land. And there is a large literature which says that in developing countries, including India, land sizes are too small to provide an adequate income from farming. The issue of small land holdings in India was flagged way back in 1900, so it's not a new issue. What we observe in the period that we actually analyze is that there was indeed a change in the share of population across land size classes. And there are differences across the Indian states. And the question that we ask is the following: can a concentration of population among the landless or the small/marginal landholders, coupled with lack of non-farm employment opportunities, actually impede the pace of poverty reduction? Using fairly standard decomposition techniques, we argue that indeed this is true. We used 2 rounds of data from the Survey of Consumption Expenditure conducted in 2004-05 and 2011-12. These surveys are representative at the national level and the state level, and also by rural-urban. Every household is given a weight, so this allows us to arrive at representative estimates. What is the metric? The metric that we use is the monthly per capita consumption expenditure, which is the total consumption expenditure of the household divided by the household size. The survey has information on land holdings of the household, which can be grouped into 4 categories: less than 0.01, 0.01 to 0.4 hectare, 0.41 to 1, and greater than 1 hectare. During this period that we analyze, the average monthly per capita expenditure in rural India did increase in nominal terms as well as in real terms. Now, since we are going to be focusing on distribution of population by land size categories, we want to assure you that this distribution that we observe in the Survey of Consumption Expenditure is also evident in the Employment and Employment Survey, which was conducted in the same year. For arriving at estimate of poverty, you need a poverty line. We have the poverty line for 2004-05 and 2011-12 for every state for both rural and urban. And we get the poverty line from the expert group on methodology for estimation of poverty. They mentioned that in the report. All members of a household are deemed to be poor if the household's monthly per capita consumption expenditure is less than the poverty line. The headcount ratio of poverty went down from 41.8% to 25.7%. And the stylized fact in the Indian context is that poverty is higher among the landless, the smaller landholders, and the agricultural laborers. And we already mentioned that there was an uneven reduction in poverty by geography, and poverty did get concentrated in 8 Indian states. In terms of the salience of land fragmentation of small land holdings, if you look at the agriculture census, there's been an increase in share of small and marginal landholders. There were 2 surveys of agriculture households done in 2003 and 2013. The real income of those with less than 1 hectare of land barely grew. The monthly earnings of those with less than 1 hectare of land is lower than their consumption. The patterns evident at the all India level are observed at the state level too. We will show you in a couple of slides that there was a change in the distribution of population by land size. When you look at the all India picture, it doesn't look like nothing much is happening, but when you look at the states, there are actually differences. And if you look at data from the National Family Health Survey, which is the India DHS, there is some supporting evidence of variations in TFR by land size class. Now, this particular slide, my apologies, it's a mass of numbers, but this is just to tell you that there are actually differences in the change in the share of population in the 4 land size classes between 2004-05 and 2011-12. These 4 columns tells you the change in each land size class, and these actually add up to 0. If you consider Rajasthan a state which is among those 8 states with a concentration of rural poor, the share of population with less than 0.4 hectare of land actually did increase. If you look at those states which don't have a concentration of the rural poor, if you take Punjab, there was a 15.6% decline in the share of population with less than 0.01 hectare of land. In a state like West Bengal, it actually increased by 15 percentage points. If you look at land size class less than 0.01 and 0.01 to 0.40 hectares. What happened to poverty in each land size class? In each land size class, the headcount ratio of poverty did decline. The extent of decline varies by land size class and also by different states. Now we want to put these two tables that I just showed you together. And this is a very standard methodology. If let P as T be the poverty in state S at time T. Now this can be written as the weighted average of the headcount ratio of poverty or any measure of poverty across the land size classes. So once you know the poverty at a point in time, what you are interested in calculating is the change in poverty, which is delta PS, which can be broken up into two components, this change. And what are the two components? The first component is the percentage of reduction that can be attributed to changes in poverty within land size groups. And this is the percentage that can be attributed to population shifts. These two components actually have to add up to 100. Now the component can be positive or negative. Now what do we exactly find? Now the blue bar is the contribution of changes in poverty within land size groups. The red bar is the contribution of population shifts. Notice that the blue bars are all positive. They're to the right of the zero cutoff here. In some states, the red bar contributes to poverty reduction. In some states, the red bar is actually negative. The value of the red bar is negative. That the contribution of population shift is negative, suggesting that they actually impede poverty reduction. In the 8 states with a concentration of poor, we find that population shifts impede poverty reduction. Recall we spoke about West Bengal, and here's West Bengal, and we spoke about Punjab. In Punjab, population shifts actually do not impede poverty reduction, but actually hasten poverty reduction. If you take a state like West Bengal, this state is characterized by an anemic growth in non-farm jobs. Population shifts actually impede poverty reduction. So this particular graph just tries to tell you that in the 8 lagging states, population shifts indeed impede poverty reduction. Now, what we have told you is basically we have unpacked the role of land and population share by land size class and what's the contribution to poverty reduction. Now, in this whole literature, people have looked at the contribution of the growth and redistribution components to poverty reduction. These are the papers by Dutton, Revelian, Huppy, and the methodological contributions of Son and Shorrocks. Now, what we can do with this particular analysis is the intra-land component that we talked about. This can actually be split into 2 parts. That is a growth effect within each land size group and the inequality effect within each land size group. So what we can do is split the intra-land component into 2 parts, which is the sum of within land size group, the growth effect, and the sum of within land size group, inequality effect. So the population shift component stays as it is. So earlier you just had 2 components, now you actually have 3 components. Now what we actually find is in the 8 lagging states of India, the population shift components actually impedes poverty reduction. And in 5 of these states, the inequality effect too impedes poverty reduction. We'll be happy to discuss this particular aspect of our results in the question and answer for those of you not familiar with this particular literature. Now, in terms of takeaway, what we have done is we have basically provided an alternative way to actually look at the factors that contributed to poverty reduction in rural India. We have decomposed the change in poverty into the growth, distributional, and population shift effects, and we've used land as the peg of the analysis. In terms of what this conference is actually discussing, we've actually referred to the importance of demographic changes and the resultant population shift in determining the pace of poverty reduction. Thank you for your attention. We'll be more than happy to respond to any questions that you might have.
All right, great. Thanks, Chandra. Chandra, for those for that video, the presentation that was just made. Now we are going to go into the discussion phase of the session, and I'm going to who talk about the paper by Amy Thornton. Muna.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry, I can't hear.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thanks for the interesting paper, Amy. I think the paper is very interesting, especially we know that there is a significant problem in terms of making data consistent to measure. Sorry, I can't put my video on. Is it possible to continue?
Yes, of course.
Yes, yes.
Your sound just blanked out for like 2 seconds, but it's fine. I can hear you.
Okay.
I think actually, Muna, as you are starting your discussion or restarting, I just wanted to emphasize to everybody that you know, your comments, questions, further questions to the presenters are welcome in the Q&A component. We don't have anything there yet, so just encouraging the participants to do so. But go ahead, Amuna.
Sorry, Muna, just one thing. The Q&A is not accessible to panelists now that you're all panelists. So please use the chat actually for the questions. If you have any written questions, put them in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, for the correction. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I have a lot of comments, a couple of comments in the paper, which I'm going to send to Amy. I think you guys have done a great job. Especially, we know that there is significant problem in terms of analyzing trends in any issue in South Africa or other countries because of lack of consistency in terms of survey instruments used in various surveys. So you guys did a great job in terms of trying to harmonize data to analyze the headship trend in South Africa. But I have still concerns whether the approach you guys used really address the inconsistency in the two household surveys, the October household survey and the general household survey. For example, if you look at figure 1, when you did the decomposition of changes in headed households into demographic and headship rates, I can see that there is a significant drop in the number of new households formed by Black females between the two surveys. I know you try to explain, justify that there is some story that can be explained the structural gap, but I think the gap is very large. We need to explain a bit about this, or if there is any approach to correct. And my take from the decomposition is that it's a very interesting analysis because it shows us clearly what is also the limitation of such kind of analysis if you want to use such kind of data. So I can say that the main driver of genuine increase in household formation is that the behavior of females, and it's only during the early period of after the fall of apartheid. So that's the main driver of this genuine increase in headship household formation is driven by female, mainly Black African female, and it's only happened during the first part of the survey, the October household survey. And I'm wondering how do you really justify that if you don't have data on migration, that we know that there was significant migration of female Black African females just after the fall of apartheid.
Sorry, could you just clarify that question a little bit? Sorry, I think the audio is a bit fuzzy.
In the decomposition analysis, after the decomposition analysis, I can see that the main driver of genuine household formation is that it's because of women, largely it's because of driven by women, and only during the first household survey, the October household survey.
Yes.
And
Yes.
for me, I think you need to really find a way of linking this to migration. Because during that period, we know that there was significant migration by women, like African women especially. I know there is limitation in the data that you said you can't do that, but I think maybe you can use qualitative information or other surveys to reflect on that, because that's important. So I'm gonna send you all of my comments.
That would be great. Thank you.
That's all for me.
Great.
Sorry for the background noise.
Thanks a lot, Muna. And Muna, for those comments, I will then ask Amy Thornton to give her comments on the Chandra and Kartikeya paper.
Great. Yes. Now I've just turned the page and that's where I wrote everything down. Here we are. Okay, I found it. Hi. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed reading the paper. It was sort of a new literature for me. I've worked with decompositions, but I haven't worked so much. Well, I don't know that much about India. So to summarize the paper, it seems like land, well, in India, land is really closely tied to rural welfare. And there's this problem where you have states where fertility is really high, but the same amount of land. And so as people proliferate, dwindling or landlessness is increasingly becoming a problem. And so what this paper does is its innovation is to think about the size of land that people are living on as a chief analytic category when thinking about changes in poverty. Things that I really liked was that I thought this was a good illustration of just how complicated addressing something like poverty is when you've got these very different demographic processes that are happening. Like, it was very clear that there were completely different demographic patterns happening in different parts of the country. Yes. One thing I did think, though, was, and I see you brought it up in the presentation, was you showed us a map. So as an outsider, someone who doesn't know very much about it, who's reading the paper for the first time, I did kind of wonder, because you made this connection between these EAG states, and I was like, well, where are they? And then later on in the paper, which I think is my main comment, in discussing your results, you point out that there's a lot of heterogeneity, there's a lot of variation, and it seems like even you guys were having difficulty in like drawing cohesion out of this because there was so much going on. And so one thing I did wonder was whether there was some sort of regional pattern going on, but I couldn't really make that connection. So, okay, I think my main comment is that when you start the paper, you're really talking a lot about fertility, but then when you get into the decomposition, you're talking a lot about population shifts. And I guess in the presentation, you sort of tamped it down on that connection a little bit more. But I mean, it is true that fertility and these population shifts are not quite the same thing. And I understand the story that you're thinking, right? More people are having babies, and so you're expecting that there will be this population shift towards landlessness. I can see that connection. But when I look at your table 4, which is the table that you put up with the population shifts in the presentation there, it wasn't always clear to me that that pattern was emerging, actually, even in these EAG states. And I thought that was quite interesting. And it did, I think, bring out something with the decomposition, which is, I think, a perennial problem when presenting decomposition results, right? Is that your decomposition will tell you the direction of the effect of the change, how the change in X affected the change in your Y, okay? But we don't always know how X changed. In what direction did X change? So when you're trying to figure out what the major patterns might be, because what you did in the presentation and what you did in paper was you highlighted specific cases where like things seem to make sense. But what might help in drawing out these patterns is to take your table 4 maybe, where you're thinking about these population shifts and classify the change. So think, okay, well, here we have a pattern of landlessness. This might be something that you've already done, which is why you haven't done it in the paper. But for example, see, all these states have this pattern of landlessness, there's growth at the bottom. All these states have this pattern of the opposite pattern. There's growth at the bottom, or there's this other like humped pattern where there's shrinking at the poles or something. And that might help bring out some patterns, because that's a key part of describing the mechanism, is this change in the population shift and how that then connects to the population shifts. But at the same time, even though I'm saying this and that there was this like maybe slight disconnect between the fertility story and the population shift story, you did ultimately get this result where these population shifts had negative effects for these EHE states. So there's definitely something going on. I just think maybe that mechanism needs to be a little bit clearer. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed it. And I like that your second decomposition as well. I thought that was quite interesting. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then Chandra, if you can then discuss Muna's paper. Thanks a lot, Amy.
Thank you, Muna, for the very interesting paper. So post-COVID and post the lockdown in different countries, a literature has emerged which tries to look at which are those populations which are vulnerable to this COVID shock, and the ones which are most likely to be affected in terms of labor market earnings. At least in many countries, I've seen studies in terms of how labor market has been affected, how household earnings have been affected, and how this would affect poverty and inequality. So in that sense, people are looking at potential impacts of COVID lockdown. But what these papers actually lack is that they don't know the vulnerability of the population that they're analyzing to COVID. So what I liked about Muna's paper is that their paper starts by actually looking at which are those geographies which are vulnerable to COVID. And for this, they actually use data from the year 2016. So in that sense, it's consistent with the work that's been done in the last 6 months across different countries. I think just a couple of clarification questions is like, so you use data from 2016. Would those households be still in the same place in 2020, or would they have actually moved out? The second question is, agreed, you have basically mapped this vulnerability, but at the end, is there something that you're actually going to do further in terms of either in terms of labor market earnings or ability of households to cope with these shocks, or ability to finance any healthcare expenditure that's actually emanating from these shocks? So in the beginning, as I said, much of the literature on labor markets starts by saying this is going to be the impact on poverty and this is going to be the potential impact on household earnings, without any attention to what percentage of the population is actually vulnerable to this particular risk. So they don't have that piece of the puzzle. But you have the other piece of the puzzle, which is like what percentage of the population is actually vulnerable. But would you have any data of any kind which would basically say what are actually the effects that we are actually talking about for this vulnerable population? So these were just the two questions I had, but I really enjoyed reading the paper and I learned quite a bit. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. So now I think I'm gonna turn this back to the to Catherine, who will moderate the Q&A. I think Catherine, maybe starting with the authors responding to the discussants and then opening up into the other questions. But over to you and take it from there, Catherine.
Sure, great. Yes, I think I'll give the authors an opportunity to respond. And if a few of you have some questions in the Q&A, but if you don't get to the responses on those, I'll ding you on them in a minute. So why don't we go in order of the comments, I guess. And I suppose we'll start with Amy, if that's okay, because I think Muna had given comments first on Amy's paper.
Great, thanks.
Got that right. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the main concerns that Muna had were around consistency between the two surveys, and then around how to cope with migrancy, given the boom in female headship happened in the 90s. And these are two very difficult things to deal with, and I don't think I solve them perfectly or that they can be solved with the data that I'm using. So with the structural break, what we have is one survey that happens in the 90s, and then I start using trends with a different survey that commences in 2002. But what I do is I look at cohorts. So I look at headship rates by age, and the idea is that there shouldn't be big breaks in these age-specific headship rates when that cohort crosses from one survey to another. And I find some cause for concern, but overall, I think I'm convinced that these overall patterns are reflected in the cross-sectional trends, but not perfectly, definitely an asterisk next to that. And then in terms of migrancy, this is a huge problem. This is, I mean, yeah, we in South Africa, a collection of very well-respected researchers have recently just released a book on migrancy in post-apartheid South Africa. And I think it's really shone a light on just how difficult it is to measure this in our national surveys, because we don't have good questions on it, and our definition of membership is so strict. There isn't much that I can do about it. And the main thing that I do is I think about the kinds of characteristics that are associated with migrants. So in some of the work on single person households, I think about people who are in informal dwellings and people who are in urban areas and people who are maybe a bit of working age. But unfortunately, there's not very much I can do. But I would say that some of that change or that boom in female household formation that happened in the 90s probably was driven by this increase in migrancy. So we know that more women started migrating during this time or joined the corps of like oscillating migrant laborers at that time. And I'm sure that that was a part of it. Unfortunately, I can't see more than that, yeah, which is disappointing. And I really wish we had better data. Thanks.
Amy, can I take the liberty of asking you a quick, so I think we have a bit of cushion in our time here, on the issue of what would it take to get better data, at least in the questionnaire itself. Are there ways to, what would be the quickest ways to address your concerns? So speaking to the questionnaire design, not sample.
Sure. So to questionnaire design, what we could follow a path similar to what our national panel survey does, which is where they allow for households to identify non-resident members and to also ask questions about whether people are remitting, so we can see, for example, whether households are receiving remittance income, but what's also really useful, I think, is to see whether people themselves are sending remittance income, because I think that's the really hard part, is to some extent, if you add this question about can you identify a non-resident household member, if we added that question, we could see households that are sending migrants. But the other half of the question, I think it's harder, is finding the migrants themselves. And I'm not really sure how to do that. One question maybe about whether you are remitting might help.
Sorry, when you say, I'm sorry, we're small groups, I'm taking a little more, and we have time, so I'm gonna take a little more liberty here. When you say non-resident household member.
What do I mean?
What do you, yes, what do you mean? Can you clarify? Even descriptively.
Yeah, I think Muna can also jump in here, because I think Muna also works on NIDS, I'm sure. But in NIDS, you're allowed to add people to the household who you would identify as a household member, but who haven't necessarily slept in the household for the past 4 nights. So in South Africa, what we often have are people who have this dual household membership. So they'll have like a rural household base, and they identify as being part of that household, and that household sees them as part of that household. But they are living for most of the year in a city where they have a job and sending money back. So the way my data sees them, as it sees them in the city as living in the city, but they're part of this household that's stretched over space. So if you went to that rural household and said, who's in this household, they could say, we also have this other person. They're not here right now, but they're living in the city, but we could add them to the household.
Yeah, the problem there, of course, is, the concept of the household is, well, I think you risk mixing short-term, long-term migration and the subjectivity of what it is to connect to other groups of
Yes,
people who live in other physical dwellings. So
yes.
maybe your best, maybe rather than identify those people on the roster, going about it through the remittances approach to understand what is the connection of this group of people who are physically in the same space with other individuals through, cash or social contact in some way. Anyway, it's a really tricky problem. Someone who's worked on household questionnaires and survey design. All right, so thank you for letting me ask that specific question. We have a question in the chat, but let me digest that one and come back to Amy and ask for, let's see, who would be next? Kartikeya to respond to Amy's comments, please.
Yeah, Chandra, I'll respond to Amy's
Yeah,
comments.
sorry about that. I
that's
misread on the panel. Apologies.
No problem. So thank you very much, Amy, for the comments. I think you're spot on in terms of how the flavor of the paper, the way we wrote it and the way we presented is different. The paper has a more of a TFR focus, whereas the PowerPoint, we pegged it with from the land focus because we got this paper, we've been writing it for over a year and we got that, we got a lot of feedback on this. So that's why that thing's actually changed. So in terms of, the point is there is no one story that would explain poverty reduction patterns across the large populous states of India. And nor do we claim to give one unifying story behind it. And I looked at the chat box and there were a couple of questions. The first thing is that we are saying that population change could be driving land distribution changes, but there's actually nothing causal in this paper. We have not claimed anything causal. We've just done a simple decomposition. It's an algebraic exercise backed by some theory saying that how does poverty and inequality, how do they change because of this dependence on land and also on the population shifts? To answer Nico's question, so the issue of small land holdings in India, this was flagged 120 years ago. The father of Indian Constitution, the person who wrote the Indian Constitution, he wrote in 1910 saying that unless India manages to tackle the problem of small land holdings, poverty reduction and income improvements in rural India is going to be tough. And this has been written about for a long, long period of time. And it's only now that we are basically saying that we really need to ease land leasing laws, facilitate land leasing. How do we allow farmers to actually, rural households to augment their land holdings? So there is some policy policy changes that's happening on that account. And also there is also a clear emphasis on focusing on income of the farmers. There is a move towards which says that we want to double the income of the farmers. So from a policy perspective, is there a recognition that there are possible levers which could actually be activated? The answer is yes. And at no point are we suggesting that population or TFR is the problem. We argue that it's the lack of non-farm jobs, alternative opportunities, and the inability to augment land size. That's actually the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me just, I think that you had addressed, well, we did have a question in the chat about if your decomposition method assumes that land and population changes are mutually exclusive. The population shifts affecting land distribution. But I think.
So yeah, I kind of like said that we really don't say anything causal about it in that sense.
Great. And can you speak to the policy implications of your findings a little bit or hint at them?
Yeah, so the first is you have to address the issue of small land size holdings. So as I said, there is a effort of the government of India and the state governments to ensure that the land leasing markets become more effective. That's one peg of the story. But the bigger problem is the only jobs that India has created in the last 10 or 15 years are jobs in construction. So there are really not enough non-farm jobs. And if you look at the 2017-18 or the 2018-19 survey, there has been an increase. Well, India has moved towards universal primary education, educational attainment has increased, but now India has reached a stage with very high rates of unemployment among the youth and also the educated. So it's a question of anemic job growth to which there is no easy fix. But can you do something about land leasing? The answer is yes. And as I said, this is a 120-year-old problem, trying to fix land size holdings. So in a way, we are telling you nothing new. It's just that we use the decomposition technique to quantify a story that's very casually and popularly told. And there is no one story that's going to fit the different states.
Fair enough.
And
all right.
I'm going to go a little bit off topic. Kathleen, I very rarely do I have a moderator whose paper I actually teach in a course. So your paper in Tanzania, where you did this experiment, this one, I actually teach that in my course. I remember that because you're asking Amy about all the questions on the survey. Then I remembered that I teach yours. It's a great paper. My students enjoy reading it.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you. That's lovely. All right, let's now shift to Muna, and maybe you can comment on the discussion points raised on your work. Thank you.
Hi. I'm back now. Thank you for the comments, Chan. Your name is very difficult to pronounce. Okay, can I say Chandra?
Yeah, Chandra is good. Thanks.
Yeah, it's in short. Thank you very much for the useful comment. Yeah, the first question is where we use the 2016 survey, and you're asking whether the households would be in the same place. So, within given that there is a short period of time between the happening of the COVID and the survey, we don't expect significant change in terms of household locations. But we also try to use a more recent data set to avoid this concern. We use a more recent data set from 2018, which is a general household survey, and we analyze the vulnerability index up to province level. Because the data set for the 2000 GHG is representative up to province level. We cannot go down to municipality level. That's why we use the community survey, which is available only in the 2000. So when we compare the results up to province level, we find very significant similar results. There is no significant difference in terms of our estimation. So because of that, we are confident that there is no significant difference in the location of households. Of course, we also expect not necessarily location of households, even availability of access to the public service might change within those 2 years. But our results show there's no significant difference in terms of those also availability of access to basic services. The second suggestion is whether we would like to see the impact of the lockdown on COVID, on labor market outcomes or poverty. There are already some studies which within South Africa which have analyzed the impact of the lockdown policies and the impact of the COVID on various indicators, welfare indicators, and labor market outcomes. There are already research there. But of course, it's very interesting if we incorporate it in our spatial analysis. I think we're gonna consider that if we can incorporate it. But what our analysis shows that also when we do our analysis and link it with wealth effects, we also are able to show that poor people are more vulnerable, and other studies show that poor people are more likely also to lose jobs, to lose income. So we can really link that discussion into our paper. Thank you.
Muna, can I take the liberty of asking you, since COVID is an ongoing struggle and changing shape, what are your plans for future work, for ongoing monitoring or tracking for your own research agenda?
One of the research agenda we are considering now is whether if we able to get data at municipality level in actual COVID infections. We want to compare those figures with the vulnerability scores we have estimated at the municipality level, and see whether these two measures can correlate. At the moment, we don't have that data set.
Sorry, to clarify, I apologize. Yes. So you're looking at the municipal infection rates.
Actual infection rate, yeah.
And the idea there is that a driver of the economic impacts is the morbidity associated with the pandemic?
So people whose living conditions, like people who are in poor living conditions, are more likely to, whether they are more likely to be infected or not.
Sorry. Okay.
Because we now use indirect approach to measure vulnerability.
Yeah.
They use their household condition.
Mm-hmm.
That's because we don't have data at municipality level for the moment.
You know, that I think that will be quite interesting. I haven't heard a lot of work happening from that perspective for low and middle income countries, but I might not be in the loop. But certainly in the US, just descriptively, the race patterns are pretty stark, and it's assumed to be associated with socioeconomic conditions and living conditions, but I don't know how robust, how robust that is versus, say, the type of work people do and where they work in explaining infection rates across groups, but I haven't tracked that. Okay, well, thank you very much, Muna. And now we have a couple of minutes left. We have an ongoing discussion about panel data and the tricky issues of individuals changing their living arrangements, not just in terms of location, but also who they live with. And I won't repeat all of the what's in the chat about that, but I'll say, as someone who's worked on panel data, I don't even like the phrase a panel of households, because I don't even know what that means. Certainly not over the span of like a year or two. So I almost think we need to rethink how we describe panel data and the definition of a household over time. Just my 2 cents there, my plea to everybody. Amy, do you want to add anything from your exchange with Ian in the chat on this point about data issues and constructs of householdship?
Well, I guess maybe I just have some questions on this, actually, maybe if there's some people who would sit here and listen to my question. So in terms of studies of household formation, a common thing that people do is to use panel data or often retrospective data, and then look at how people move across households over time. And the panel data that South Africa has is not a household panel. As you mentioned, it only purports to be a panel of people. But this panel, so one of my original ideas was to use the panel and to do some survival analysis and see like how long it takes for people to form a household, for example. This seemed like an obvious thing to do, and it's something that people have looked at in previous literature. Okay. But our panel, and this is my question, is quite chunky. Like there's like almost 18 months to 2 years in between waves. And to me, this seemed like quite long. So if I'm interested in looking at when someone becomes a household head and how that connects with when they get married or when they get divorced or when they get a job, it seemed like 18 months could be quite a long time when 2 of those things could happen at the same time. So I sort of dismissed this idea. I was like, that seems like quite a long time. But like most people's panel data is just a year. So then I started to question myself. I was like, maybe this is fine and I could do it anyway.
I mean, unless you had a lot of marriage and remarriage rates, a lot of job transition, I don't think 18 months is enough time. But, you know, maybe this will be a session for next December, because even the term form a household, I would say we could debate that for hours on end. I don't. And one approach that we've been taking, I'll just say it's very quickly, I'll make a pitch from the gender perspective, really pushing from moving away from the concept of headship. In fact, if you look at high income country household surveys, they don't have the term head on the questionnaire anywhere. They look at the relationship of all the individuals who reside in the dwelling together to understand the construct of the household, but they do not define someone, they don't let the household define headship. And I think that it's time that surveys in middle and low income countries start catching up to where the high income countries have been for a couple of decades. Now, that's not to say you don't have dominant income earners and dominant personalities in households. We just bring a lot of baggage when we bring the headship concept. And I'll leave you with one last idea, which is rather than look at who's the head and who's not the head, you can look at the households by typology of one income earner, you know, one male income earner, two male income earners, et cetera. And that's some work that was done in some bank work like 2 years ago, putting out that typology approach, which we're embracing with UN Women. But I've gotten off to my own pet topics. I'm going to take the liberty, Ellie, I think you're still with us. This is the last session of 3 days of lots of papers, lots of great work, 3 wonderful plenaries. We're going to have a meet the author session following this one. So I hope everyone can stay with us and jump over there. And for those of you who can't, good luck with all of your work. Thank you so much for joining. Elia, is there anything you'd like to add? Any wrap-ups I'm missing?
Oh, yeah. So just to thank the authors as well for this really exciting discussion that we've had here. It was the second, the virtuous second ISSP Population Poverty and Inequality seminar. And I think the 3 papers here really add to the overall theme of this group. I should have actually later. I just mentioned Catherine Bigo. Maybe all of us know her here, but she's the lead economist at the World Bank Group, and she led the World Development Report, deputy director in 2013. So, and a member of the panel, of the ISSP panel. So to end, because this is the last session, of course, we'll go to the Meet the Authors session shortly. But for those who are not coming there, just really to thank all the participants who have been part of this session, as well as part of the whole conference. Thanking ISSP for the amazing organization. We have on our own group here, Paul Monette, who has been really there with the panel through and through, and other staff as well from the ISSP. But also just to remind everybody here that the big ISSP conference, the 2021 conference, International Population Conference, will happen in December 2021, and the call for papers will close on May 15th. So I hope you all be putting in papers, and it will also be a virtual conference. So I'm hoping to see some, revisions, refinements of these papers, but also just to note that recorded sessions on this seminar here are going to be available on this website for a month, on the main conference website for a month, and even longer on the ISSP website. So happy holidays for those who have a work break during as we go towards the end of the year, and be safe and be healthy. So I think we should now shift to the. Are we just staying here for the Meet the Authors session?
No, I think we have a different Zoom link for Meet the Authors in the schedule. So.